Let's say that you were able to give a 5-step process for someone who's 30 pounds of belly fat or around there, 20 to 30 pounds of belly fat. And they were like, you know what? For once in my life, I want to get like at least a flat stomach.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not going to be super defined and under 8% body fat, but 12% body fat, roughly 10%, and I could get close.
Sure.
But everything we talked about, from sleep to emotional stress to nutrition to, we haven't talked about calories in, calories out, or lifting and things like that yet, but from other things we talked about, if you had to give a 5, bullet point process of like, this would be the foundational steps to get you started on losing that 30 pounds of belly fat, what would you say?
Yeah, I'd say, and I've talked about this before, step 1, very clear and defined breaks between meals, whether you are snacking or not. What I mean by that is, rather than grazing throughout the day and constantly keeping insulin levels high, I find people have much more success by having very clear, defined gaps. So I don't care if you're fasting or not, but eat breakfast and have a very clear and defined break until lunch. Have a very clear and defined break until dinner. Allow yourself the ability for insulin levels to come back down, glucagon levels to come up, so that you're actually getting into a fat burning process between these meals. Every time you're consuming something, you're kind of stopping that process for a little bit.
Interesting.
Right? Even if your calories are, yes, that comes into equation, but you need to have these peaks and valleys a little
Breaks between consumption.
Yes.
Now, can you consume water, teas,
Yes.
coffees, anything
For sure.
else?
Anything 0 calorie. I mean, it's,
0 calorie.
yeah, I think people will naturally eat less doing that too. But I do think that we have to take little bits from the calories equation and little bits from carb insulin model and meld them together instead of having these two camps that are largely opposed. And that's where I say, hey, this seems like an equal, delicate, thoughtful acknowledgement of both sides. You're probably going to eat less by having these clear defined meals, but you're also taking into account letting insulin levels come back down nice and low, and you're not keeping them chronically elevated, which we know is not good either.
Yeah.
So that's usually rule number 1.
Okay, step 1. Yep.
Step number 2 is very similar, but I say have a minimum 12-hour break between your last meal of the day and your first meal of the day.
So 12-hour fasting minimum.
And it's not really a fast, right? Like
Sleep and don't eat after 8.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a reason why you get your blood work done after a 12-hour fast, right? Things tend to come back down to homeostasis. Give yourself a chance to get back down to this balance. There's a multitude of different reasons why that's beneficial. Insulin levels getting lower, insulin sensitivity getting much better, so the food that you do eat with breakfast is going to be much more, able to be taken up and utilized, which leads into step 3, breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper, right? So you're kind of tapering as the day goes on. So larger meals in the morning, if you're not fasting, which we'll talk about here later, if you're not fasting, having a larger meal in the morning is generally going to be better. And if you look at the research, it's very, very clear that people that have a larger breakfast end up eating smaller lunches and smaller dinners naturally.
Because they feel satiated, right?
And that doesn't mean that you go eat a box of Fruit Loops or Cheerios for breakfast, right? And with that, I'll kind of dovetail into a slightly different piece that kind of coincides with that. Okay, there was a BMC medical genomics study that's probably one of my favorite studies that demonstrated that you can have higher fat content in the morning because you end up starting the day with more insulin-sensitive muscles and less insulin-sensitive fat cells. What that means is you have less likelihood of storing fat as fat in the morning, and that way you start your day with higher fat, higher calorically dense meals. So maybe steak and eggs, something like that, without a bunch of hyperpalatable carbs, right?
Yes.
Something that's calorically dense. And then as the day goes on, taper calories. Carbohydrates are lower calorie than fats, even though they do spike your glucose and spike your insulin. It's okay to have those at night if you're not overdoing it. So a lot of times what I will do is I will have a higher fat breakfast. I will have something like steak and eggs for breakfast, or usually like steak and like ground beef. I'm a big fan of like that Joe's scramble kind of thing that you
so
do,
good,
right?
man.
With like a little bit of goat cheese, a little bit of feta, maybe some like lox, make it very Mediterranean. And that's pretty high fat, so it's calorically dense, right? It ends up being like 800 calories, right? Then as the day goes on, like a slightly smaller lunch, and if I am having carbohydrates, they're usually allocated to the evening time. That doesn't mean I'm having cakes and pies. It means maybe I'll have some lentils, maybe I'll have some, something Mediterranean, right? then that's going to naturally be lower calorie because there's not as many fats in it, right? So your day is just kind of going like this.
Before the interview continues, if you feel like you're not living your most authentic life, not leaning into your purpose, and not living the life that your future self would be extremely proud of, I've written a new book called The Greatness Mindset, and I think you're gonna love this. Through powerful stories, science-backed strategies, and step-by-step guidance, The Greatness Mindset will help you overcome all the different challenges in your life to design the life of your dreams and then turn it into your reality. Make sure to click the link below in the description to get your copy today. Okay, let's get back to this video. What's the breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince,
Dinner like a pauper.
like a pauper? Gotcha.
Yep. So and that's just age-old wisdom, right? It's
There you
like
go.
that's like
Small dinner,
I remember
yeah.
my, I'm largely like Mediterranean. I'm mostly Italian, so it's like I look back at that and like my grandmother was always kind of saying like she always had these light dinners, these little teeny dinners, right? It was just like, and you look at a lot of the Mediterranean cultures, and with the exception of when they're having big feasts and stuff for special events, like a lot of times they are having really small dinners, right? And they're like shutting it down right after dinner. It's like maybe they'll have a little bit of coffee or whatever it is they're having, and then go right to sleep.
Yeah.
And then when you go into step 4 is your diet should optimize your sleep. Right, that's something that we kind of talked about in the beginning, but the best way that you can optimize your sleep without really digging super deep into what is stressing you out and causing this sort of internal battles that might be keeping you up, cutting your food out a few hours before bed is usually very, very powerful for people. And that, again, it nicely coincides with everything I'm talking about. Again, if you're having those 12-hour breaks between dinner and breakfast, well, then the earlier you eat your dinner and shut it down, the earlier you can eat breakfast the next day, right? If you stop eating dinner at 6 p.m., you're done eating, then by 6 a.m., you're good to eat again. And chances are you're not going to roll out of bed at 5:59 and immediately go eat at 6.
No.
You're probably going to naturally end up fasting longer.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be a quote-unquote intermittent faster. You're naturally kind of, getting into that category, right?
Okay. And number 5?
And number 5, and this is something that you pull the throttle on or hit the throttle on occasionally, right? You want to temporarily, like when it's time to really pull that lever, temporarily reduce fats and then bring them back up, right? So that's sort of my lever, right? If I'm following all 4 of these lifestyle principles and things are working but not working as fast as I want, what I will temporarily do is reduce fats out of the diet, even if I'm low carb. Okay, this sounds crazy, right? But then bring them back in once weight has started to come off. People forget that even if you're doing, and I'm largely a low carb guy, so I catch heat for saying this sometimes, but fats are still calorically dense. So it's the easiest lever to pull from a food volume standpoint to dramatically reduce calories really quick and then be able to bring them back. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have just this point where you're chronically restricting calories forever and ever and ever. And then the moment that you do come back up, your body's like, oh, shoot, put the weight back on.
Yeah, it's not fun.
I actually think, and there's recent research to back this up, that keeping calories moderately high and then having aggressive short-term drops, like reducing fats and bringing calories low for a couple of days and then back up, can actually be very, very effective, which is probably why fasting works so well for a lot of people that just do it at random.
Yeah.
Like they'll just be like, I'm eating 6 days per week normal, and then I do a 24-hour fast once per week. It's great because you're never letting your body get accustomed to this decline in calories. You're just like status quo, whoa, what's going on? And then back up to normal.
Who do you recommend fasting for and who do you not recommend it for?
I don't think there's many people that shouldn't do fasting to a certain degree, right? But there's a large degree of different kinds of fasting.
There's 24-hour fasting, there's 16.
Exactly. And like a 16-hour fast, if you want to put the label on it, you can call yourself intermittent fasting, but there's a lot of people out there that are probably intermittent fasting that don't know they're intermittent fasting, right? So 16 hours is I think the benefits start at 16 hours. So someone doing a 16-8 fasting, that usually works, but the reason that that's working is for 2 simple reasons: caloric restriction and insulin being lower. Nothing magical is happening with a 16-hour fast, but when you start creeping over that 16-hour mark is when the benefits start to kick in. So like I personally, I fast usually 3 days per week with like a 20 or 21-hour fast. So I'm still eating like 2 meals and I just do it 3 days per week. So it's kind of intermittent. I can't think of a lot of people that wouldn't have success doing that because almost everyone that even thinks they wouldn't be able to do it, they might get hungry the first couple of times. And then after that, it's a cakewalk. It's not, Now, people that have serious hypoglycemia issues, they should probably be conscious of it. That being said, and full disclaimer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a dietitian, but even people that are dealing with hypoglycemia, a lot of times getting their bodies adjusted to periods of time without food is actually a good thing because it teaches their body to be able to utilize alternative fuel sources so they're not reliant on this undulation in glucose.
Right.
There's certain people that, if you're very, 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 very active, then yeah, it might not work for you. Like someone that's working crazy manual labor construction. I'm sure there's different situations, clinical conditions that people shouldn't fast. And those, yeah, defer to your doctor. But as far as general people, I can't really think of anyone that wouldn't get some benefit out of it, even if it's just mentally. Anything that's got a high amount of these hydrogenated oils in it has clearly been like adulterated to become something that's, I don't want to say it's not safe for human consumption, but it's
not healthy.
It's pretty close.
It's not healthy, yeah. That's interesting. Okay, so what are some other foods? Trans fats, is there anything else you would add in the we should never have category?